The laughter started on a Sunday, which made it worse. Sundays in Redfield County were supposed to be sacred. Not just church sacred, but decent sacred. The kind of day where men tipped their hats a little lower and women held their tongues a little tighter. The kind of day where the community came together in the fellowship hall behind the First Baptist Church to eat fried chicken and potato salad and pretend, for a few blessed hours, that the land wasn't dying and the future wasn't uncertain and the rain would come when it was supposed to, as it always had, as it always would. But the moment Eleanor Whitfield stood up from the potluck table, wiped her hands on the napkin her mother had embroidered 20 years ago with blue thread that had faded to the color of a bruise, and said she was digging a pond in the middle of her best wheat field, the decency shattered like thin ice under a boot heel. The room went quiet in stages, like a machine winding down, until the only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the wind against the windows. She was 21 years old, 21, with dirt under her fingernails that no amount of lye soap could scrub clean, with her father's old straw hat sitting too heavy on her head, and with 160 acres of winter wheat that had become her entire reason for waking up at 4 in the morning. She was also, as the county would remind her repeatedly in the weeks to come, just a girl trying to run a man's farm, a girl who had buried her father 6 months prior in the small family plot behind the whitewashed barn, who still wore his oversized barn coat because it made her feel like he was standing beside her, who still set a place for him at the table every Sunday, because some habits die harder than the people who created them. And now this girl stood before 24 of the most respected farmers in Oklahoma and told them she was going to tear up 5 acres of prime wheatland to dig a hole in the ground. A pond? Silas Crane had been the first to laugh. He was 64, owned the biggest spread in the county, and had a laugh that sounded like a rusty gate swinging open in a windstorm. Eleanor, sweetheart, this ain't rice country. This is wheat country. Oklahoma wheat country. We don't dig ponds in wheat fields. We dig wells near the house, and we pray the Lord sends rain from above. You don't go destroying good cropland to make a mud puddle for the ducks. The word mud puddle rippled through the crowd. The men chuckled into their coffee cups. The women whispered behind their hands, their eyes wide with the delicious horror of watching someone commit social suicide in real time. Even Reverend Matthews, who usually found a way to soften any blow with a well-placed scripture, simply looked down at his boots and said nothing, his silence heavier than any condemnation. Eleanor felt the heat crawl up her neck, but she didn't sit down. She had learned something in the 6 months since her father's passing. If you sat down every time a room full of men told you to, you spent your whole life looking up at people who weren't half as smart as they thought they were. I've been watching the low spot in the North Quarter, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. After the last rain in March, water pooled there for 3 days, 3 full days, while everywhere else it vanished within hours. The soil stayed damp for a week. The wheat there is greener, thicker, stronger than anywhere else on the farm. There's something underneath. If I dig it out properly, shape the banks, pack the clay, line the bottom, it'll hold water. Year-round water. Water when everything else is dry. Silas wiped his mouth with a handkerchief the size of a dinner napkin. Sweetheart, every field's got a low spot. That don't mean you turn it into a swimming hole. You know what 5 acres of good wheat is worth? At current prices, that's nearly $200 of potential revenue. You know what the bank'll say when they find out you've destroyed collateral? They'll say you're a poor risk, Miss Whitfield. They'll say you're not fit to manage the loan your daddy took out to keep this place running when he got sick. I haven't destroyed anything, Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the murmur. I've made an investment, in the future, in insurance against the kind of summer everyone's whispering about, but nobody wants to name out loud. The laugh that followed was crueler than the first, not because it was louder, but because it came from so many throats at once, a chorus of dismissal that seemed to shake the windows of the fellowship hall. It was the sound of a community deciding, collectively and permanently, that you had lost your mind. Eleanor walked home that afternoon with her father's hat pulled low over her eyes. Not because the April sun was bright, but because she didn't want anyone on the road to see that her hands were shaking and her eyes were burning with tears she refused to let fall. The Whitfield farm sat 3 miles north of town, down a dirt road that turned to red gumbo after every rain and dust after every dry spell. The house was a 2-story frame, building her grandfather had built in 1901. White paint, peeling like sunburned skin, front porch sagging in the middle. It needed work. Everything needed work. The fence along the east property line had been blown down in a storm 2 years ago. The barn needed a new roof. The well pump groaned like an old man every time she primed it. But the house wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the land. The wheat had come up strong that spring. Eleanor had planted it herself in the bitter cold of October, guiding the old McCormick drill through rows so straight they could have been laid out with a carpenter's level. Her breath fogging in the pre-dawn darkness, her fingers numb inside her father's old gloves. She had done it alone because her father was already too sick to walk the fields, confined to the bed by a sickness the doctor couldn't name and couldn't cure, and because she had promised him, holding his papery hand in the lamplight on the night he died, that she would not let the farm die with him, that she would keep the Whitfield name on the deed, that she would make him proud. "Keep the North Quarter," he had whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "There's something about that land. Your grandfather knew it. I never had the courage to find out what. But you, Nell, you've got the courage. You always did. Even when you were small, you saw things different. Don't lose that. Don't let them take it from you. Promise me. I promise," she had said. She had thought he was delirious. But after the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, and the neighbors went back to their own lives, Eleanor had walked that North Quarter every morning at dawn. And she had seen what her father meant. The low spot was subtle. A slight depression, maybe 30 yards across, where the wheat grew just a little greener, a little thicker. When the March rain came, Eleanor had watched where the water went. Everywhere else it vanished within hours. But in the low spot, the water lingered. It darkened the earth. She had knelt in that spot and pressed her palm flat against the ground, and she had felt something she couldn't explain. A pulse, maybe, a promise. The land speaking in a language older than any deed or survey map. A whisper that said, "Here, water lives here. Dig, and you will find." That was the moment she decided to dig. The shovel she used had been her father's, and before that, his father's. The handle was worn smooth by decades of calloused hands, and the blade was pocked with rust spots that looked like old scars. Eleanor stood at the edge of the low spot on the first Monday of April, when the wheat should have been knee-high, and she drove that shovel into the earth with all the force her slender arms could generate. The first foot was easy. The soil was still soft from the March rain. But by the second foot she hit clay, red Oklahoma clay, dense as stone, unyielding as the men who had laughed at her in church. Each shovelful became a battle. Her palms blistered within the first hour. By noon the blisters had torn open, and she could feel the warm slick of blood mixing with sweat on the wooden handle. She didn't stop. Buck, her father's old draft mule, stood at the edge of the field, watching her with liquid brown eyes. Buck was 20 years old, sway-backed, gray around the muzzle, and stubborn as a government tax collector. But he was all Eleanor had in the way of heavy help. She had rigged a makeshift drag from an old plow blade and some chains, and when the hole grew too wide for her to throw the dirt clear, she harnessed Buck and began pulling the spoil away in loads that made the mule groan and made her own shoulders feel like they were being pulled from their sockets. By the end of the first day, she had a hole 10 feet across and 3 feet deep. It looked pathetic, a pockmark on the face of an ocean of wheat. She sat on the edge of it at sunset, her legs dangling into the darkness, and ate a cold biscuit and with jam, her throat so dry she could barely swallow, her arms trembling so badly she could barely lift the food to her mouth. The second day, Harlan Briggs came by. He was her nearest neighbor, a widower of 50, who farmed 200 acres to the east. He pulled his truck to the edge of the field and sat with his elbow out the window, watching her work for a full 10 minutes before he said a word. "Your daddy would be spinning in his grave, Nell." Eleanor didn't stop shoveling. "My daddy told me to keep the north quarter, to find out what was underneath. Your daddy was sick at the end. The fever had him seeing things that weren't there." Harlan's voice was gentle. "He wasn't thinking right. You know that. The doctor said his mind was affected by the toxins. My daddy was thinking clearer than anyone in this county." She flung a shovelful of clay onto the growing pile. "You know what the almanac says, Harlan. Drought years come in cycles. The last bad one was 1917. Before that, 1895. Before that, 1874. We're due. We're overdue. And when it comes, every farm in this county is going to wish they had water they could reach, water they controlled, water that didn't depend on the sky being merciful. The almanac also says plant by the dark of the moon, and I don't see you doing that." He spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Look, I ain't trying to be mean. I watched you grow up, but you're playing at something you don't understand. Farming ain't about feelings and hunches. It's about sense. Good, hard, practical sense. And digging up 5 acres of good wheat to make a duck pond in the middle of a wheat field is the most senseless thing I've ever seen a smart person do." "It's not a duck pond," Eleanor said. "It's insurance. Insurance is something you buy from a man in a suit in an office in town. Not something you dig out of the ground with a shovel and a 20-year-old mule." He left her with a warning that echoed in her ears. "The bank's already talking. Crenshaw's been asking questions at the elevator, measuring your debt against your assets. You mortgaged this place last fall to pay your daddy's doctor bills, and everyone knows it. They see you destroying cropland, they'll call the note. You know what that means." She knew. It meant losing everything. The house, the fields, the graveyard where her father and mother lay side by side. It meant becoming one of those sad stories people told at church potlucks, about the Whitfield girl who tried to run a farm and lost it all to foolishness. But she also knew something else. She knew that when she pressed her ear to the ground in that low spot, when the world was quiet, she could hear water. Not loud, not rushing, but there, a subterranean whisper moving through rock and clay. So she kept digging. By the end of the first week, the hole was 30 feet across and 6 feet deep at the center. It no longer looked like a pockmark. It looked like a wound, a raw, ugly, deliberate opening in the perfect green carpet of wheat. From the road, it was visible for half a mile, a circle of brown devastation surrounded by life. The neighbors drove past slowly, their trucks kicking up dust that settled on Eleanor's sweating shoulders. They honked. They waved with mock cheerfulness. One of the Miller boys threw a soda bottle into the hole from his passing truck, the glass shattering against the clay bottom. The banker came on the 8th day. His name was Arthur Crenshaw, and he arrived in a black Ford sedan that looked like a hearse. He wore a 3-piece suit despite the heat, a watch chain glinting across his vest. "Miss Whitfield," he said, not bothering to step out of the car, "I represent the First National Bank of Redfield. As you know, Your property carries a substantial mortgage. The terms require the land to be maintained in productive agricultural use. I am here to inform you that excavating cropland without the bank's written approval constitutes a material breach of those terms." Eleanor leaned on her shovel. "I'm improving the land, Mr. Crenshaw. A reliable water source increases property value." "A water source?" He laughed, a dry, papery sound. "What I see is a hole, a very large, very expensive hole in the middle of collateral that the bank holds a lien against. Do you have any idea what 5 acres of winter wheat represents in potential revenue?" "I understand that you're looking at a field and I'm looking at a future," she said. "I understand that you see a hole and I see a pond. We see different things, Mr. Crenshaw. We always have." He handed her a folded paper, crisp and official. "This is a notice of default. You have 30 days to restore the land to its original condition, to fill in this excavation and replant, or the bank will initiate foreclosure proceedings. Time is of the essence, and the bank's patience is not unlimited. Good day." The sedan pulled away, leaving Eleanor standing in the field with a notice that felt heavier than a stone. She didn't open it. She knew what it meant. 30 days to undo everything she had bled for, or lose the farm her grandfather had homesteaded, her father had expanded, and she had promised to keep. That night, she sat on her porch and watched the sun bleed into the western horizon. The wheat fields stretched away in every direction, green and gold in the fading light. They were beautiful. They were also, she was beginning to understand, a trap. A single crop, dependent on a single weather pattern, vulnerable to a single season of bad luck. Every farmer in the county planting the same thing, praying for the same rain, facing the same disaster if that prayer went unanswered. The pond, her stupid, impossible, ridiculous pond, was the only different thing in a landscape of sameness. And if that made her crazy, then crazy was the only sane choice left. She went back to digging on the 9th day, and the 10th, and the 11th. By the 2-week mark, the hole was 50 feet across and 8 feet deep at the center. The sides sloped gently, shaped by countless shovelfuls of earth, by Buck's patient dragging, by Eleanor's bleeding hands that had developed calluses over calluses. She had built a berm on the downhill side, packing the clay with her boots, tamping it until her heels felt bruised to the bone. She had lined the bottom with the finest clay she could find from the creek bed, half a mile away, hauling it bucket by bucket because Buck was too old to make the trip, and she had no other help. On the 15th day, it rained, not a real rain. A 1/4 inch that fell from a sky the color of old pewter and vanished almost as quickly as it came. Everywhere else in the county, the water disappeared into soil that had become a sponge of desperation. But in Eleanor's hole, the water collected. It was only an inch deep, maybe 2, a thin silver skin over the clay bottom, trembling when the wind touched it. But it was there, water where there had been only dust, proof where there had been only faith. Eleanor sat at the edge and wept. Not from joy, but from exhaustion so profound that her body didn't know how else to express it. She had blisters on top of blisters, some infected. Her back felt like it had been beaten with a board. Her shoulders had developed knots the size of walnuts, but there was water in her pond. She ran to the house and returned with a mason jar, one of her mother's old canning jars with the blue-tinted glass. She filled it from the puddle, holding it up to the light. It was brown, full of clay sediment, but it was water, her water, captured and held in a place where every other drop had been lost. She showed it to no one. She knew what they would say. So she kept the jar on her kitchen table, where she could see it while she ate her sparse meals, where she could touch it with her fingertips and feel the cool proof that she hadn't been entirely wrong. But the weather had other plans. April turned to May, and the sky turned to brass. Day after day, the sun rose angry and set angrier. baking the land until the wheat began to show stress. The tips of the blades turned from green to yellow, not the healthy gold of approaching harvest, but the sickly yellow of a plant beginning to die of thirst. The old-timers started meeting at the grain elevator, shaking their heads. "Driest spring I can remember," they said. "Worse than 17. Maybe worse than anything." Eleanor watched her wheat with a mother's anxious eye. The field around the pond, what she had come to think of as the water quarter, looked slightly better than the rest. The plants nearest the excavations seemed greener, stood a little taller. She told herself it wasn't just hope playing tricks on her mind. She told herself the moisture from the pond was seeping outward, creating a halo of protection in a dying world. But she didn't tell anyone else. She had learned that lesson. By late May, the drought had become a disaster. The creek beds cracked open like broken pottery. The stock ponds shrank to muddy circles surrounded by dead grass and the bleached bones of fish. Cattle lowed in the heat, their ribs showing. Farmers began hauling water in barrels, spending money they didn't have to keep their animals alive. And still, Eleanor's hole held water, not much. The inch from the April rain had become a half-inch, then a quarter-inch, then a thin film of mud at the bottom, but it hadn't vanished entirely. The clay lining held what little moisture remained like a clenched fist refusing to open. She began carrying buckets from the house well, which was sinking lower every week, the pump straining like an old man climbing stairs, to pour into the pond. Just a few gallons each evening, enough to keep the bottom from drying completely. It was insane. Everyone else was trying to save their cattle, their gardens, their households. Eleanor Whitfield was trying to save a hole in the ground. Harlan Briggs found her doing it one evening at dusk. He stood at the edge of the field, his silhouette black against the red sky, and watched her pour a bucket of precious well water into the mud. "Nell," he said, his voice heavy with grief, "you're pouring drinking water into a ditch." "It's not a ditch," she said. "It's a hole that don't hold water. You're killing yourself for nothing. Your well's going dry. I can hear the pump straining from my place. And you're carrying water by hand every evening to feed a mud puddle in a wheat field." He stepped closer. "The bankman's been to see me. Crenshaw's circling like a buzzard. He's called 3 loans already this month. Miller lost his east section yesterday. The Johnson place is next, and you're making it easy for him." Eleanor set down the empty bucket. "What would you have me do, Harlan? Plant more wheat? Pray harder? Pretend I didn't see what I saw? I'd have you use sense. Sell off the stock before they're worthless. But don't throw good water after bad dirt. That hole's going to dry up, Nell. It's just a matter of time, and when it does, you'll have nothing. No water, no wheat, no farm, no future." He left her there in the gathering dark. Eleanor sat on the edge of her pond with her feet in the mud, listening to the night sounds that weren't there. The crickets were quieter than usual. The frogs had gone silent. Even the owls seemed to have left. But in the mud at the bottom of her hole, something moved. A frog. Small, brown, desperate. It had found her water and claimed it. Eleanor watched it sit in the moonlight, its throat pulsing, and she felt a kinship so sharp it hurt. She wasn't alone in her madness. Even the frogs knew that water, any water, was worth fighting for. June arrived like a furnace door swinging open. The temperature hit 90, then 95, then 100, then 105. The wheat began to wither in earnest. Fields that had been green oceans turned to brown deserts. The stalks grew brittle, snapping under their own weight. The dust came next. It started on a Wednesday, a brown smudge on the northern horizon. Eleanor was in her field when she saw it, a wall of brown advancing across the flat land, eating the sky as it came. She ran for the house, but there was no outrunning it. The wall hit with a sound like a train derailing, a roar of wind and dirt that filled her eyes, her mouth, her lungs. It turned day to night, a choking darkness that lasted 6 hours. When it passed, Eleanor emerged to find her world transformed. The wheat was buried under an inch of dust. The pond was filled with silt, the water completely obscured. She walked to it and began to dig it out with her hands. The silt was powder fine, slipping through her fingers, but beneath it she found the clay bottom still damp, still holding. Still there, the frog was gone, probably buried, probably dead. Eleanor felt its loss like a small death inside her, but she kept digging until she reached water again, brown and thick but water. And when she looked up, wiping the dust from her eyes, she saw something that made her heart stutter. Birds, dozens of them. Meadowlarks and sparrows, circling her pond, landing at its edge, dipping their beaks into the mud. They had come from miles away, drawn by the only surface water for miles. Her water was an oasis in a desert, and where there were birds, there was something else. Eleanor watched a meadowlark snatch a grasshopper from the dust, then a sparrow diving into the wheat, emerging with a struggling insect in its beak. The grasshoppers came 3 days later, not a swarm at first, just scouts. A few dozen of the big green and brown locusts, landing in the wheat, testing, tasting. But Eleanor knew what scouts meant. She had heard the stories from her grandfather about the swarms that had come in the 1,870 seconds. She walked her field at dawn. They were landing in the west quarter, the south quarter, the east. They were avoiding the north quarter, avoiding the pond. At first, she thought it was imagination, but as the days passed, the pattern held. The grasshoppers devoured the wheat farthest from the pond. They stripped the south quarter bare, leaving a wasteland of splintered stems. They attacked the east, the west, moving in waves that sounded like dry rain. But the north quarter remained relatively untouched. The insects moved on to easier pickings, to the dry, stressed plants that offered no resistance. Eleanor didn't understand it, not then. She would learn later that the moisture from the pond kept the wheat stems tougher, less palatable, harder for the insects to digest. She would learn that the birds, attracted by her water, had established a hunting territory around the pond, picking off grasshoppers by the thousands every day. She would learn that the microclimate created by those few gallons of captured water created a bubble of life in a sea of death. But in that moment, all she knew was that her wheat was still standing while her neighbors' fields were being devoured. Harlan Briggs came to her door on a Sunday morning, 2 weeks after the dust storm. He didn't laugh. He didn't offer advice. He simply stood on her porch and said, "I need to see it." She led him to the pond. It was pathetically small, maybe 2 feet of muddy water. But the wheat within 50 yards of it was green, alive, standing. Harlan walked the perimeter in silence. He touched the wheat with hands that trembled. He knelt and felt the soil, still slightly damp. He looked at the birds in the nearby fence posts, fat and content. "How?" he finally asked. "I don't know," Eleanor said. "I really don't. I thought there was a spring. I was wrong about that. But I was right about something." He stood up. "The south quarter's gone. Miller lost everything yesterday. The grasshoppers took it down to the dirt. Crenshaw was out there with his camera, documenting the damage for the foreclosure papers." He looked at her, and his eyes held awe mixed with shame. "You saw this coming. Somehow you saw this coming." "I saw a low spot that held water," Eleanor said. "That's all. I saw something everyone else walked past every day. Something they never thought to look at twice, and I decided it mattered. I decided it was worth being laughed at. I decided it was worth losing everything." "It mattered," Harlan whispered. "Lord help us all. It mattered." The heat broke in July, but not before it had done its damage. The county was a wasteland. Fields that had been green oceans were now brown scars. Cattle had been sold for pennies or left to die in the pastures, their bones whitening in the sun. Wells had gone dry, and families were hauling water from the creek in town. The bank had called 17 loans, and 17 families had packed their belongings and driven away. But Eleanor Whitfield was harvesting wheat. It wasn't a full harvest. The West had withered to nothing. The South had been eaten by grasshoppers. The East had died of thirst. But the North Quarter gave her 312 bushels of grain. Small, hard, drought-stunted grain. But grain. Real, sellable, life-saving grain. She threshed it herself, working the old machine until her hands bled again, shouting at Buck to keep walking in circles. She bagged it in burlap sacks and loaded them into her father's old truck. She drove to the grain elevator on a Saturday, when the town was gathered for the weekly market. The streets were full of farmers who had nothing to sell, men walking with the hollow gait of the defeated. She didn't mean to draw attention, but the sound of her truck with a load of wheat, when every other farm had nothing, was an announcement that couldn't be ignored. They came out of the feed store, out of the diner, out of the bank where Arthur Crenshaw stood in the doorway with his polished shoes and his foreclosure papers. They watched her unload sack after sack of grain onto the scale, the golden kernels spilling like treasure. Silas Crane was the first to approach. He looked older than he had in April. The drought had carved new canyons in his face. His farm was gone, every acre stripped by heat and insects. "Where'd that come from?" he asked. "The North Quarter," Eleanor said. "The one with the hole, the one with the pond," she corrected. Silas touched one of the sacks with hands that shook. He opened it, letting the grain run through his fingers. It was small, yes, hard, yes, but it was there. Eleanor Whitfield had produced actual grain. She had turned dust into bread. "How much?" Crenshaw asked from the bank doorway. His voice was smaller now, less certain. 312 bushels, Eleanor said. "Enough to make the mortgage payment, enough to buy seed for next spring, enough to keep the farm, enough to survive, enough to prove that sometimes the crazy idea is the only one that works." Crenshaw stepped into the street. His polished shoes sank in the dust. "Miss Whitfield, we may have been hasty in our assessment. If you would consider refinancing, perhaps at more favorable terms." Eleanor set down the sack. "You wanted me to fill in the hole, Mr. Crenshaw. You told me I was destroying collateral. You told me I was a poor risk. You told me I wasn't fit to manage my father's farm. You gave me 30 days to undo everything I had bled for. I was mistaken." "Yes," Eleanor said. "You were." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply stated the fact, letting it hang in the air like the dust that coated everything. "You were mistaken." 4 words that contained an entire revolution. Harlan Briggs stepped forward. "Nell, I owe you an apology. We all do. Every person in this county who laughed, who whispered, who stood by and said nothing. We were wrong, not just about the pond, about you, about what it means to farm, about what it means to have faith in something you can't see. You owe me nothing," she said. "You owe yourselves a lesson." She looked around at the faces, at Silas Crane, at the Miller boys, at Reverend Matthews, at Crenshaw. The land talks, not in words, in patterns. We've been farming this county for 40 years, and most of us have never really looked at it. We've planted the same crop, prayed for the same rain, done the same things our fathers did. And when the same disaster came, we were surprised. We stood in our fields and asked why, as if the answer wasn't written in every cracked creek bed. She gestured to her truck. "I dug a hole because I saw something different, because I was willing to be wrong, to be laughed at, to lose everything for the chance of being right. And I was right. Not because I'm smarter, but because I was willing to look stupid for the possibility of being wise. I was willing to be the only one doing something that didn't make sense, because sometimes sense is just the accumulated fear of people who never tried anything new." The silence that followed was deeper than any laughter. It was the silence of people confronted with their own limitations. Eleanor finished unloading her wheat, 312 bushels. At the depressed prices, it wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was survival. It was proof. It was hope. She drove home with enough money to pay the bank, to buy groceries, to face another year. But she didn't go straight to the house. She stopped at the pond. The summer had not been kind to it. The water was down to a few feet of brown liquid, surrounded by cracked mud. The birds still came, but fewer now. The frog sat on a clay ledge, watching her. Eleanor sat on the edge and dangled her feet in the water. It was warm, almost hot, but it was water. Her water. The water that had saved her when every expert had sworn it didn't exist. She thought about her father. There's something about that land. Your grandfather knew it. I never had the courage to find out what. But you, Nell, you've got the courage. She had thought he meant a spring, but she realized he had meant something else entirely. The courage to be different. The courage to look foolish. The courage to trust your own eyes more than you trusted the world's opinions. The courage to dig when everyone else said stop. The pond wasn't just water. It was proof that the experts could be wrong, that the crowd could be blind, that the thing everyone laughed at today might be the very thing that saved them tomorrow. It was a monument to the fact that wisdom doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes, wisdom looks like a 21-year-old girl with bleeding hands and a shovel, digging in the dirt because she felt something no one else could feel. Eleanor Whitfield was 21 years old. She had dug a stupid pond in the middle of her wheat field, and they had called her every name a small town could conjure. Delusional. Foolish. Crazy. But when the hottest summer in history arrived, when the drought turned the county to dust, when the grasshoppers stripped bare every field except hers, when the banks took farms and families drove away, when the experts were proven wrong and the sensible people lost everything, that stupid pond became the smartest thing anyone in Redfield County had ever done. And as the sun set over her north quarter, painting the water with colors that no one else had water enough to reflect, Eleanor smiled. Not because she had won, not because she had been vindicated, but because she had been right to try. And somewhere, in the cool mud at the bottom of her impossible pond, a frog sang.